You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Welcome, friend, to episode 153 of the Business for Good podcast. Well, it seems like after the last episode that a lot of you are interested in getting your hands on some of Meatly's cultivated meat dog food when it hits the market, and I certainly count myself among you on that one. Hopefully, CEO Owen Enser's timeline predictions are accurate and they start selling in the first quarter of 2025. Wouldn't that be something? Now, I mentioned this is episode 153, which means that, of course, there are 152 back episodes with awesome and inspiring content just waiting for you to check out. Nearly all of them are evergreen and great, but if you want to start with listener favorites, you can see on our homepage at businessforgoodpodcast.com which are the most all-time downloaded episodes and go by the wisdom of the crowd, if you please. Now, on to this episode, from which I learned a lot. I was already familiar with fungi cell culture because of my work with the Better Meat Co., as well as animal cell culture from my time writing the book Queen Meat, but I was less familiar with plant cell culture until I started researching this episode. So we all know that chocolate is sweet. The way that it is made, though, not so much. From deforestation and climate change to child labor and heavy metal contamination, cocoa farming leaves a lot to be desired. But what if we could make cocoa powder without having to chop down the rainforest and engage in so many other unsavory practices? That is what California Cultured is working on now. The Davis, California-based startup has raised $16 million to grow cocoa cells inside of bioreactors and has already produced some pretty tasty chocolate from this process, as I can personally attest. This isn't their CEO Alan Perlstein's first shot at growing food inside of bioreactors. As you'll hear in this episode, Alan was part of the team that a quarter century ago grew the world's first ever cultivated meat. It was goldfish cells funded by NASA. He went on to found Miraculex, which is now Oobli, which grows sweet proteins inside of bioreactors. After running the company for 6 years, Alan is now embarked on a new journey to divorce cocoa production from farming the rainforest, and he shares that story here. Can they compete on cost with farmed cocoa? How long before their cocoa makes its way onto the market? Most importantly, does it taste as good as the chocolate that we eat today? These are questions that we bite into and more in this conversation. Alan, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Thanks, Paul, for inviting me here. Glad to have a chance to chat with you.
It is my pleasure. We have been in many of the same circles for many years. We haven't gotten a chance to talk that much, so I'm really glad that we're getting a chance to do it here. And you first crossed my consciousness when you were running Miraculex, which became Joywell and eventually Oobli. And you were really interested in sweet proteins. So before we get into what you're doing now, what got you into biotech and synthetic biology in the first place that you thought, hey, let's make sweeteners out of proteins?
Yeah, so that sort of took a long and winding road. I originally got excited about the food tech space around the early 2000s. I was involved with one of the very first cell cultured meat labs in the US, in a tiny lab in Bayshore, Long Island, trying to grow cell cultured carp or cell cultured goldfish. So I was involved with a lot of some of the early work that went into that type of technology. And that's sort of
idea. Yeah. A lot of the people, when they think about cultivated meat, they think, oh, well, the first burger was in 2013. If they have read the book Queen Meat, they know that actually the first cultivated meat was around like 2000, which I didn't realize you were involved in, where they grew goldfish in a NASA-funded project to see, could you grow meat in space? So that's riveting that you were involved in that 24 years ago. What was your role? You must have been a pretty young guy.
Yeah, that was still while I was an undergrad. I was looking for a lab job, and evidently I was one of the very few people to apply for this really unique role. Many people who applied to it didn't even understand what does it mean to grow cells or for food. But once I sort of started to understand what its implications were, it sort of allowed me to start really diving into this type of technology and sort of starting to mentally explore where the next steps of this technology will evolve into. And it's very exciting that now your company and many others are sort of still working on this cutting edge new food technology, which is just constantly improving year by year.
Well, that's generous of you. So before we get into the more modern era, so a quarter of a century when you're working to grow goldfish cells, were you thinking, hey, this is something that's going to be useful for long distance cosmic tourists, or did you see an on Earth application to try to displace conventional animal based meat production?
Well, the only thing that made sense at the time was for interspace travel, just because of the tremendous cost. Even then, we sort of saw there were three massive technological hurdles to get through, and the thought process was NASA could at least pay for a little bit of them so it could get started. And just like many different NASA innovations, there was obvious quite a bit of potential for Earth-based applications. So we saw that it was going to take definitely a good generation or two for some of this technology to be created, tested, and we're definitely very surprised that VCs sort of bit into it and they allowed a lot of this technology to be de-risked, a lot of the story to be told, and basically educated most of the world in why cell culture meat and alternative meats are important, not only for human health, but also planetary health as well.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what you helped to foment along with the researchers who were engaged in that goldfish product. I remember I had Jason Matheny on this podcast, who is now the CEO of the Rand Corporation, but he became the founder of New Harvest. And it was news reports about the goldfish research in 2000 that inspired him to go on and found New Harvest and become a evangelical for cultured meat. So you, in many ways, have helped to foment the cultured meat revolution, which, as you point out, led to billions of dollars in venture capital flowing into this space. So hopefully it all comes to fruition. So far, it hasn't really made a dent in meat production yet, a quarter century on. But you said 1 to 2 generations. So maybe there'll be another quarter century from now. It will be a major part of humanity's meat consumption. We'll see. But that's enough on your 2000 work, because fast forward like 15 years or so and you're into sweet proteins. Like, what happened? Why were you thinking, we need a better sweetener that isn't based on a carbohydrate?
Yeah, so during this time, I was working in a lab in Columbia University in New York City, specifically on different kidney diseases. And I happened to sort of see a lot of the causes of not only kidney disease, obesity, diabetes, heart attack, stroke, many of these health elements were all basically coming down from diet, and especially with people's inherent love for sweetness, whether it's sauces or candies, cookies, cakes, sodas, drinks. It's literally surrounding us day and night. And during this time, I was also seeing quite a bit of activity on these newer proteins that companies were developing, from the heme protein from Impossible, or alternative egg proteins from was it Just at the time. And we sort of started seeing you could replace a lot of these more destructive or unethical produced ingredients by using biotech, and specifically these interesting classes of proteins. So as I looked into it, I sort of discovered this area of science, specifically on protein science, where they had these sweet proteins, but they never were really commercialized. And a lot of these reasons were, oh, you had to figure this out, you had to develop a lab, you had all these very expensive processes. But also at the same time, the cost for doing this type of work drastically was decreasing. So saw this really unique opportunity to take my skills from working in the cell culture meat industry, working in this laboratory, and putting it to trying to figure out how we could sort of solve one of humanity's oldest addictions, sweeteners and how we could make them better for people and healthier. And to me, the thought process is if you're going to start a company, try to focus on something where quite a bit of humanity is addicted to, and it's currently sort of destructive. And how could you significantly make it better for not only humans, but also the planet at the same time?
So it's very clear why you would want to, let's say, replace animal-based meat. It's very clear to me why you would want to come up with something that sweetens without having the glycemic load that sugar has, and why you'd want to come up with a sweet protein. But after 6 years at Miraculex, which again is now Oobli, you decided you're going to depart and you're going to start a chocolate company. It isn't as clear to the average person why chocolate, right? Chocolate is not, cocoa, unlike sugar, is perceived as very healthy, right? You're told to eat more dark cocoa, not less, like with sugar, where we're told to eat less. So why try to replace cocoa farming? What is the benefit of doing so?
So during my time at Miraculex, now Oobli, we were looking to develop a lot of different chocolate products, which Oobli eventually launched. But during this time, I saw and sort of had a deep dive within the chocolate industry and saw that many of the ways that chocolate is being produced today hasn't really changed in the last couple hundred years. You still have, for all intensive purposes, very poor farmers under usually forced labor conditions, spending the vast majority of their life under really brutal conditions in the forest to grow, harvest, and process chocolate. And the conditions for doing that have gotten a lot worse, where now they're using these really toxic pesticides and fungicides to keep some insects which are spreading some of the major diseases at bay. And in essence, over 100 years ago, when most of the world's chocolate was produced in South America, there happened to be this weird cycle in the 1900s where it was hot and wet very quickly, just like we're seeing today, which led to the rise of the specific fungal disease called witch's broom, which destroyed about 95% of all cocoa in South America. And we're seeing the same exact weather patterns and disease states happening to hit West Africa, where about 70% of the world's chocolate's being produced. And to make matters even worse, a lot of this labor that goes into it is unfortunately forced child labor. So you have mass deforestation, you have issues with these toxic chemicals, issues with child labor, all getting worse and worse and worse. And even though that there were laws passed, people were talking about it, these issues were never really fixed. And in essence, because at the end of the day, most of this stuff is happening in the middle of the jungle where no one really knows what's happening.
So you made a couple arguments there, Alan. The first is the unethical nature of the cocoa farming industry, right? You're accusing them of engaging in forced labor, even child labor. You're also making an argument just about practicalities, that with climate change, that it's going to be harder and harder to produce cocoa. And you're saying that, basically cocoa is in short supply because of this already, that it's going to get worse. The other thing that I was surprised by when I was reading more in advance of our conversation here was about the greenhouse gas impact of cocoa production. Because, normally if you look at a chart of foods and the associated greenhouse gas emissions per serving, you've got like beef and lamb way up top, and then, it's like pork and then chicken, and then you start getting into like tofu, and way at the bottom, it's like lentils, right? And so it's normally all these animal foods up there and then all the plant foods at the bottom. But with cocoa, I was shocked that it's actually way more greenhouse gas pollution emitting than many animal foods, including pork and poultry. That it was really shocking to me how high it was. And I'll share this chart in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com so that people can see it themselves from our world in data. But that was kind of shocking to me. I didn't realize that cocoa was such a driver of greenhouse gas pollution.
Yeah, right now it's estimated for every kilo of cocoa that's being produced, roughly about 20 to 30 kilos of CO2 is released. And there's also quite a bit of methane, which is even more impactful than CO2 being released. And a lot of this is just because it takes an incredibly long time and a large amount of resources from carbon intensive fertilizers, fuel, pesticides, fungicides. It has to go through a multi-step, multi-country processing. It basically goes from in the middle of jungle from Africa, gets shipped to the port, goes to another location for roasting and deshelling, another location for crushing and turning into a liquor, and another location for then turning it into its final product. And then it goes into another location for to be sold. So it just travels literally around the world once to twice before it enters a consumer's, pocket. And we basically see there's a lot more superior and newer ways to grow foods rather than technically shipping them around the world multiple times.
So let's talk about those new ways, Alan, because you're making a case that it's really inefficient to produce cocoa the way that we've been producing it for centuries. But what's the better way? You're growing cocoa cells in bioreactors. So why is that better?
Yeah, we see this as a really superior way to grow it because not only do you reduce the carbon load, you don't have to deal with these labor issues, you don't have to worry about pesticides, fungicides, and especially into the time today when we're trying to also avoid lots of really harmful ingredients, toxins or pesticides that could sort of find their way in today's food system. We're trying to avoid that completely, making sure that these products could be sold at affordable prices for consumers, as well as making these products for the first time lead and cadmium free, which unfortunately is sort of this big side effect of growing in these specific cocoa growing areas. So we're just trying to provide a probably a lot more cleaner, more ethically provided ingredient to consumers. And many consumers are trying to also cut these ingredients, these harmful ingredients like lead and cadmium out of their diet as well.
Okay, so you've made a case for why it's better to do it in bioreactors, but let's talk about how you actually do it, right? So listeners of the show will be familiar with animal cell culture. We've had many episodes about this, right? So you basically take a biopsy from an animal and you have all these millions of little cells in there. You can put them inside of a bioreactor that kind of mimics the conditions within the animal's body. The cells grow into animal-based meat. That's the general oversimplified way to describe the cultivated meat process. There's another process of precision fermentation where people are taking microbes and turning them into factories that produce something else. That's what you were doing at Miraculex, trying to produce these proteins from some host organism. But you're doing plant cell culture, which is not like either one of those. So what's the difference? Like, what is plant cell culture?
So, plant cell culture is the technology to isolate a cell from a specific species. It's to then bring it to sort of this early stage stem cell like state and then get it to mature in a different way that it could grow inside of a bioreactor or a large vessel to produce a specific compound or biomass. For us, yeah,
So what you just said to me sounds like it could also be said about animal cell culture, right? So how is it
exactly.
So how is it different? Like, I presume that you believe it's cheaper and easier to do plant cell culture than animal cell culture. So why? What's the difference? What's happening that is better in that sense?
So plants are a lot more resilient to environmental conditions, unlike mammalian cells. They have some internal defenses while they're still in their cellular state. So they don't necessarily need an extensive immune system like animal cells usually do. That's one really big benefit. The others are it grows at room temperature. It doesn't need It doesn't necessarily need to grow at mammalian body temperature. The medias are a lot more cheaper and accessible. For instance, we could source a lot of the active plant phytonutrients, which basically tell the plant cells how to grow from rice waste, from tomato waste, from potato, from coconuts. For instance, one of the major components is a compound called zeatin, which is found in very large amounts in coconut water. So we basically can source a lot of the nutrients which our cells need from a lot of local suppliers without necessarily worrying about the other ethical impacts. Oh, you need fetal bovine serum or a fetal bovine analog or different ways of growing these rare compounds where we could source them in a relatively abundant way. And the third, probably most important technology is the reactors themselves. We sort of figured out how to cut out like 99% of the costs of these reactors. And we saw that if you could bring the cost of these reactors down sort of a magnitude in price, you could really change the way the price as well as the process of how these things could be scaled.
That's riveting. So is this special type of bioreactor something that you invented, or is this something that's just typically used in plant cell culture?
Yeah, so we started on using some previously available technology, but we've basically been iterating on these earlier reactors. And we were very influenced by the local Sacramento beer and wine industry, of where they were able to take these relatively inexpensive tanks and use them for fermenting, for not only fermenting beer, grains, and other things. We modified them quite a bit in order to be used for plant cell culture. And over the last 2 years, we were growing out of these newer, ultra low costing reactors.
That's very cool. So what's the largest reactor of this kind that you've worked in?
Right now, we're in middle of scaling up and activating our 200-liter reactor. This is going to allow us to start planning our next size scale. Eventually, we're aiming to have about a 2,000-liter reactor and having these mass produced with our partners to be placed in our facility as sort of a pilot plant, so different companies could sort of see how this could operate at scale in different locations around the world.
Very cool. Very cool. So if you look at animal cell culture, my understanding is that the largest mammalian cell culture tank in the world is about 20,000 liters. It's actually not that far from where you and I live in Sacramento. Do you know, like, are there plant cell culture reactors larger than that? Like,
Yeah.
are you familiar? So, okay. So
Yeah.
what's this? What's the state of the play in the industry right now?
So it has been, I think the record was close to 100,000 liters.
Okay.
With successful cycles. There are two major companies in the world that have been using plant cell culture. One company is based in Germany, has been growing a anti-breast cancer drug called Taxol in 75,000 to 100,000 liter reactors. And there was a company in South Korea, growing cell-cultured ginseng at over 100,000 liters. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, so these types of companies saw, oh, wow, these compounds are very valuable, expensive, but they're also environmentally destructive to farm on a very large basis. So they roughly figured out about 15 years ago how to use some older pharmaceutical technologies that were decommissioned, and they revitalized these bioreactors to grow plant cells. So we saw a lot of different technologies to grow them, and we see the next big step is lowering the cost by using these lower cost reactors.
Awesome. I definitely want to talk about cost, but I just want to ask about your business model first. So my understanding is that you're going on a B2B strategy, right? Like you want to create a cocoa powder. You're not trying to put chocolate bars on shelves to compete against Hershey yourself, right?
Definitely not now. We see the big problem in this technology, and maybe the biggest risks are making sure it tastes amazing, it has the cleanest label possible, and a relatively competitive price. Once we basically solve that, we can explore other options. But many of the largest chocolate companies in the world want a more sustainable, want a higher quality chocolate while still being able to provide it at a very fair and affordable price. And that's what we're working with some very large companies to provide.
Cool. So let's talk about that pricing issue because obviously that drives everything, right? So if you don't ever outcompete cocoa on price, it's unlikely to ever become anything more than a niche product. And I know you are interested not just in the margin, but also you're interested in making a dent in the problem that you're trying to solve here. So I was actually reading about recently when kerosene displaced whale oil, and I was wondering how much cheaper did kerosene have to be in order to displace whale oil, right? And because it's kind of the same thing, you put a liquid in your lamp at home and you light it up, and that was it. And in effect, kerosene, it was patented in 1853, and at first it wasn't cheaper, but quickly it became cheaper. And it was about within a couple of decades, it was literally half the price of whale oil. And this is why the whale industry was decimated so vigorously and so rapidly after kerosene came onto the market. In your case, I've read news reports that say that you guys intend to at first have pricing that is commensurate with like high value nutritional chocolate on the market. I wasn't sure what that meant, but what do you think? I presume this is the highest end chocolate today. How long do you anticipate it might take for you not to, let's say, outcompete cocoa, but at least to become somewhere in the ballpark of competing on price with commodity cocoa?
Just like the advent of kerosene and the thousands of oil derricks and supporting technologies that allowed it to scale, we're aiming to do the same thing with our technology. We don't necessarily have to go searching for oil and drill a well. Our biggest challenge to get this price down is about scale and how many systems we could set up and finding the right types of industrial partners to work with as we reduce the price. So we see this taking somewhere between 3 to 5 years to start scaling up to the levels necessary to start approaching prices that you see on the supermarket shelves. So it's not that long, and it doesn't necessarily take that large of a scale up to get there.
What's the capex associated with that? So it's 3 to 5 years to get to somewhere around price parity with commodity cocoa. What's the capital expenditure needed, do you think, to scale up to the level that you want to get to? Let's say 75,000 or 100,000 liters of capacity.
Yeah. So for us to get to the capacities we need, we're most likely looking in the low tens of millions of dollars for us to start generating the cocoa and cocoa butter and our other ingredients at relatively close to commodity prices. And we see that this technology could even beat today's commodity prices, let alone what it's going to be looking like in the next couple of years.
So it's pretty affordable compared to other types of biotech scale up. Low tens of millions may sound like a lot of money to somebody not initiated in the biotech world, but that's a pretty low amount of money for creating something of that type of magnitude. So
it has to be.
Yeah. So it sounds like you believe that you are within striking range of a few years away, perhaps, of competing on price. But earlier, Alan, you mentioned taste. And if it doesn't taste great, then obviously, it's not going to work. So if you're not yet there on price, are you there on taste now, or are you still working toward taste parity with cocoa?
So cocoa has roughly over 2,000 unique compounds that are responsible for its unique aroma, taste, creaminess. And we've already been working very hard to actually produce the vast majority of them. We think we have about 70 to 85% of the flavors there. And what we're working on is pushing up these levels of these natural flavor compounds at the same time. So as of today, we are probably about 80 to 90% of the way there when we formulate with many different products such as different chocolate bars or candies or confections. It's basically identical in many of the flavor and tasting components. And our focus right now is mostly on those single origin unique chocolates that you could find that have creamy notes, cherry notes, plum notes, these really rare varietals that are very difficult to produce. That's where we're focused on now. And probably in the next year to 2 years, we're going to be releasing more mainstream milk chocolate flavors as well.
So you're talking about releasing within the next year. You're currently going toward 200 liters of capacity and you want to get to 2,000 liters. When do you think? I read a couple articles in this past year or so that indicated that you wanted to release by the end of 2024. Now it might be the beginning of 2025. What's the current state of thinking as to when you might release something, even from a pilot scale facility that somebody could utilize?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, many people, when they hear about cocoa or they're hearing about dark chocolate, their mind thinks, oh, isn't there something healthy about that? And the answer is yes. So, for a very long time, there was a big suspicion that there were these healthy compounds inside of cocoa, and these very large chocolate companies like Mars, Barry Callebaut, started doing these investigations into it, and they found that there's this compound called a cocoflavanol that has a really profound effect on human health. In the last couple of years, there was this very large double-blind study called the Cosmos study, which showed these cocoa compounds reduced issues resulting from heart attack and stroke and AFib over 30%. And different researchers in different universities around the world, like here, UC Davis, have found that cocoflavanols are really great for joint pain recovery due to arthritis or athletic performance. Meiji, a very large chocolate company in Japan, saw that these cocoflavanols helped with mood, relaxation, and sort of feelings of wellness. And researchers in Columbia University saw that these compounds were also beneficial for short-term memory. So if you sort of put all these benefits together, there's sort of this panacea of effects all in these really interesting cocoflavanol ingredients. So we are intending to launch a 25% cocoflavanol product with a partner by next year. So these cocoflavanols usually occur in cocoa in less than 1%, and we figured out how to massively increase these cocoflavanols in the first lead-free and cadmium variant. So people could actually have these really healthy compounds in the cleanest way possible today. And we're aiming to make it a lot more affordable. So many of these components sell for $30 to $50 just for a month's supply. And we're looking to launch a product that's very competitive with that in the next year.
Okay, very cool. In addition to the plethora of benefits that you mentioned, one other interesting body of research that I have read actually is cocoa's impact on muscle synthesis, which is pretty riveting. That studies show, and I'll include this in the show notes at businessforgoodpodcast.com, that taking cocoa powder after an intense workout not only reduces muscle soreness, but increases the muscle's ability to grow afterwards. So it's basically like a natural muscle enhancer, which is pretty awesome. And for that reason, I consume cocoa on a daily basis, and I have eaten your chocolate before, a sample that you made one time. It was very good, but I hope to be able to get your 25% flavanol one day. That would be pretty awesome. So, Alan, you obviously, in order to get that low digit tens of millions of dollars, I know that you raised a $4 million round in 2023. What is the company's total fundraise from inception in 2020 to the present?
Roughly, we've currently raised about $10 million in total as of today. We're still in the middle of raising a further Series A. We're currently in the middle of it. We're using this capital to expand, pursue our regulatory approval and moving forward. But just like many different food technologies today, the bar to raise capital is incredibly high. I like to refer to it as milestone inflation, where the milestones that might have been good enough in 2021 or 2022 definitely do not cut it today. every company has to understand how to hit some significant partnerships or sales or technological breakthroughs that could allow them to really figure out how to raise. And this is sort of, I think, the struggle that many companies are figuring out today. And companies like yours who are launching products and finding partnerships and scaling, I think is the right way to go. We all the companies today, we don't have infinite amount of time to launch products like we've used to. The name of the game is launching as quick as possible, iterating, gathering all these really great partnerships. And in essence, it's become a lot more brutal in the landscape. And there's now patent wars, which you guys are fighting and other companies are fighting. There's
Yeah, in our case, fought. We
fought, yeah,
we had
successfully fought,
yes.
successfully fought, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you're obviously speaking about an experience that's very resonant with me, and I am, constantly impressed by the perseverance of so many entrepreneurs who, even in this very difficult environment, are still finding ways to tighten the belt, to continue to make progress, and find ways to survive. Obviously, not everybody survives. There's a lot of companies that have failed already in the biotech food space, but I'm constantly impressed by so many of the folks who are working really hard and just beating their head against the wall with the conviction that the wall is going to break before their head does. So my hat is off to you, Alan, for the success that you've had so far, and I really hope you get a chance to scale up. It's an impressive journey that you've been on, and I'm certainly rooting for your success. And I'd love to know, speaking of success, what resources have there been for you? I mean, you spent 6 years at the helm of Miraculex. You've now spent 4 or 5 years doing excuse me, working in the chocolate space at California Cultured. Have there been resources for you that were useful that you'd recommend for others that might be beneficial for them?
Yeah, there are quite a few. Obviously, finding the right networks or accelerator programs if you are into the food tech space or the biotech space. I went through SOSV twice with both my companies and was very happy with the quality, not only of the networks, of the program, the training, and the resources that they provided, and they seeded quite a bit of revolutionary technologies which are currently out on the market today. We basically are very happy with the Sacramento regional investors and networks. They've helped attract a lot of international media attention, which allowed us to attract even additional financing. We've seen even the local Davis and Sacramento startup environments have also been beneficial for us to grow. But quite a bit, I've also been doing a lot of reading, a lot of different books, podcasts, such as Paul's, has been relatively insightful to understand the thinking of other CEOs, as well as understanding different people's perspective when it came with food, technology, and business.
Very good. Well, I'm glad that there are so many recommendations that you have out there for people. We'll link to SOSV for those not familiar with them. It's a very cool accelerator and venture capital fund, and I'll link to that in the show notes so people can go check them out and apply with them if you desire to do that. Finally, Alan, what companies do you hope people will create that don't yet exist? You've obviously been doing this for some time now, so I presume that there's something out there that you wish somebody else would do since you are occupied making chocolate.
Well, it's thinking about sort of the big problems of today. Humanity needs a lot of raw resources in order technically to scale up. We have a lot of very big plans. We want to make more sustainable foods. We need to feed people cheaper than ever before. We need resources for AI chips, houses, computers, cars, sustainable energy. And the only way to do that is basically getting more resources. And currently that means either digging in the dirt, chopping things down, which is destructive. And to me, I think the real big next push of technology is using a novel biotech or new organisms to mine and harvest basically the world. There's billions of tons of heavy metals in ocean water, in the soil, in waste facilities that are basically locked in there. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting opportunities using a mix of microorganisms, AI, and robotics to basically mine these places in a non-destructive way in order to power the future that we all desperately want. And I think that's going to be an incredibly important area for future entrepreneurs.
All right. Well, hopefully somebody's going to take your advice, Alan, and they're going to start something really cool in those fields. And we'll hear about it perhaps on a future episode of this podcast. Somebody will say they were inspired by you to go start that venture. So I appreciate all that you're doing, Alan. I can't wait to see your chocolate commercialized, and I'll look forward to getting to try my next bite of California culture.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.